On today's episode of What the Ship, MSC and Maersk are ending the 2M alliance. 2023 has been a rough start for dry bulk tankers, gas, and container shipping. Shipyards are faced with capacity issues. Euronav and Frontline merger is off the books. And finally, why Seablindness and not Putin could be the biggest energy threat. I'm your host, Sal McCoglano. Welcome to this week's episode of What the Ship. We have been off for a week. Didn't get last week's episode in. Just a crazy week for me at work. Unfortunately, I have a full-time job, and that is as the chair of the Department of History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science at beautiful Campbell University. And the beginning of the semester was a bit difficult this year. But we're back right now, and we're going to dive into the top 5 maritime stories of the week. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, so you'll be alerted about new stories as they come out. All right, let's jump into our number one story for today. Our number one story deals with the breakup of Maersk and Mediterranean Shipping, the 2M alliance. I just appeared today on Freightways, but I filmed this yesterday. And this was the hot seat with Bill Priestley, 10 questions. And I want to show you what question number 8 was and my response to it. And this is before the news came out.
Number 8, will we see an end to the alliances at the major shipping level? And if so, how will this be broken up?
I think what you're going to see is to be on the lookout for is a split between Maersk and Mediterranean Shipping. They're in an agreement for another year or so. And they're the biggest. I mean, you're talking about 35%. They are the big behemoths. And the question is, do they keep going together because they're the big force? You're getting to the point where they're getting so big that if they get over 40% of the share, it's going to be a problem. And so they may wind up splitting to do it. And then you always have the issue of them targeting one or more groups to kind of run them out. Right now, you got 3 alliances with 9 companies spread across them, but there's always the danger of what we saw in 2016, 2017 with the Hanjin Marine being targeted and run out. But I think the big thing is to watch a split between the 2M alliance, Maersk and MSC.
All right, that is my only moment of insightfulness I'll probably have in my entire life. Right there, that I predicted the day before the alliance splits that they're going to announce it. But in truth, I have to tell you, if you've watched this sector, and this is not me being Nostradamus by any means, if you watch the sector, this was looming on the horizon. We've been talking about this for a while. If between these two, Maersk and MSC is now the largest, they're controlling over about 35%. And if you get over 40%, that's going to be a big trigger. So the breakup of Maersk and MSC is not surprising. Reuters story over at G-Captain kind of talking about this issue in some detail. Again, Mike Schuller over at G-Captain goes in a little more detail here, talks about the 2M breakup, and it leaves Maersk in a tight spot. The two companies announced that they're mutually agreed. Now, this doesn't go into effect for 2 years. We're not going to see this happen until January of 2025, but there's a 2-year notice that has to be given. And the question is, who's going to be in the worst spot, Maersk or MSC? MSC is now the largest of the groups. And I think Maersk actually is in a bit of a better spot here. I'm going to disagree with Mike Hazen here a little bit because MSC has been saddled with a lot of old tonnage. They've been buying ships like crazy in the open market. And that works fine when the market was booming and everything. Now we're about to see things change. And I think Maersk may be in a little bit of a better position. Plus, I think Maersk has been making inroads with some companies. So I'm not going to be surprised if once this alliance busts, that you see Maersk team up with Zim and maybe one other big carrier out there to put themselves in a pretty good position. I don't know if it'll be Evergreen or CMA CGM, but I think it'll be a big carrier, probably not ONE, and I don't think HMM. Well, HMM is a weird one in that they may do that because that may be a company they think they'd be the best one to do. But what we're seeing here, and again, this is part of this long history here of the container companies forming these alliances, with 2M having the biggest share. You have the alliance with Haup-Hog, Yang-Min, and ONE, which is a conglomerate of 3 lines. And then you have the Ocean Alliance, that's CMA CGM, that's Costco, and that's Evergreen. And again, if Maersk can pull one of these companies, or MSC, pull one of these companies off, they'll form a new alliance. And I think that's what you need to be watching out for. This right here, a story from Greg Miller, the surge finally over, U.S. imports back near pre-pandemic levels. I think that is a major issue to see, that we're seeing those levels come back. These charts here, and we'll go and zoom in here a little bit on these charts to give you a little bit of a better view here of what we see. So here's the port tracker. This is showing import volumes, and what you see is 2023 is above 2019, 2020 levels, but below the peak of basically what we're seeing in 2022 and 2021. So this is a pretty good forecast. And again, this is the actual versus the forecast. So we'll have to wait and see. We've got the January numbers now right up on 2019. But the question is, do they spring back as we're expecting? Finally, here are the container import volumes with the final December in for 2022. Still record year. Amazing level coming off of 2021 into 2022. But again, it's a tale of two halves. First half was booming, second half dropping. And the question is, where do we go going forward? This story off the West Coast ports here. West Coast ports bear the brunt as inbound containers drop off. We talked about this in a previous story I did. This is about the escape from LA and the heading over to the East Coast and Gulf Coast. We're seeing that in this chart here with the decline of percentages to the West Coast, to the East Coast. Back in 2017, we were in the mid 50s, and now we're in the mid 40s. And so we're just seeing this decline. And we're seeing the same thing over in Europe as Europe ports brace for slowdown as the shopping frenzy ends. The big variable right now, I got to tell you, is this notice I received the other day. This is from the ILWU Local 10 Longshoreman Bulletin out of San Francisco for Oakland. This is the president's report. It is time to set aside our differences amongst one another and concentrate on what we think is best for Local 10 regarding a new contract. The lockout is commencing, 4 exclamation points. SSA has informed the union that they plan to send 55 of our steady equipment operators back to the hall starting today. Other companies might follow suit. The next move from the employers will be to stop the night work, followed by no weekend work, starving the membership. You better believe they've got their game plan for us. So again, we do not see right now on the West Coast an agreement between the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, and the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, that represents both the terminals and the shipping companies. And because of the slowdown on the West Coast, labor is no longer in the driver's seat like they were a while ago. And this is one of the reasons we believe that the labor negotiations has kicked out this long. Now labor is really in the secondary seat, and the owners and terminal operators are in the driver's seat, and they're going to start pushing ILWU to start getting some concessions. Let workers go, automation, all these issues are at play. It's going to have a big effect on container trade. All right, let's jump over to story number 2. Story number 2 is a story from Greg Miller over at FreightWaves. Rough start to 2023 for dry bulk, tanker, gas, and container shipping. And I want to go through each of the sectors that Greg talks about here because I think there's a lot of interesting information here. So he's talking about dry bulk, always weak in the first quarter and is more exposed to China than any other shipping segment. Rates have particularly low this year. The Baltic Dry Index fell to just 740 points on Monday, lowest level since June 2020 in the early stages of the pandemic. BDI has fallen 41% since the beginning of the year, 87% since the latest peak in October of 2021. According to Clarkson's, spot rates for Capesizes were down to $6,100 per day on Monday, close to cash break-evens. Spot rates for mid-sized bulkers, the Panamaxes, were at $9,500 today, Supramaxes at $7,200 per day. So a couple of quick notes on this one, just want to talk about. So one of the things we're seeing is copper on the rise again in terms of price. That is particularly good news because if we're seeing copper go back, that means that China's consuming more of it. And that means we may see these freight rates for bulkers change again, something to keep an eye on. Let's go ahead and look at crude and product tankers. So Greg's got this. Crude and product tankers remain very profitable, much higher than they were this time last year. Nevertheless, they're down sharply from the highs in the fourth quarter. Spot rates for very large crude carriers, these carry crude oil, were at $38,200 per day. That's triple the rate a year ago, but almost 2/3 less than the $119,600 per day high in late November. Sanctions on Russian crude, including self-sanctions, may affect demand for Suezmaxes and Aframaxes. Jump down here a little bit. Rates for these tankers have pulled back from previous highs, but less so for the VLC rates, likely due to sanctions. Clarkson estimates rates for modern-built Aframaxes were at $80,000 per day on Monday. Again, over 5 times rates a year ago, but down from the high of $111,000. Product tankers also have seen a big step down. So the big variable here is this last sentence. Furthermore, the European ban on import products starting February 5th, quote, should lead to a substantial increase in ton miles. And as I've said before, and you're probably getting tired of me hearing this, the big issue is not how many tons you ship, but the distances you ship them. And because Russia will not be exporting crude oil by ship into Europe and the G7, they're going to have to go in the EU. They're going to have to go to other places. And so India, China, Africa, South America is the place they're going to go. That's going to put a requirement on more tonnage and more miles. And because there's a fixed tonnage out there, that means transportation will be at a premium where we can potentially see the rates jump back up. All right, let's go to LNG and LPG. So LNG shipping market was one of the biggest beneficiaries. Mid-November spot rates for benchmark tri-fuel diesel engine LNG carriers hit $455,000 per day. More efficient two-stroke LNGs were reaching $503,000. Spot rates have fallen all the way back down to $68,300. Man, it's a fall there off the rates. According to Clarkson's, vessel capacity is more plentiful and utilities appear to be more optimistic about post-winter gas inventories. Market sentiment is also getting hit by capacity fears, unlike in dry bulk and oil tanker shipping, where there are minimal vessels on order. The LNG order book is extremely high. Just talked about this, and we'll talk about this again in a little bit. LPG sectors also face pressure from high order books. So everybody was envisioning that LNG was going to be the big market, but the problem is winter has been really mild. And Europe has been much quicker in getting facilities built up to house natural gas. We've seen the tankers necessary to regasify LNG be put in place quicker than expected, and the storage facilities ashore built at a faster pace. But the variable here will be if the winter turns. We're not in winter yet. We're in mid-January, but we still have another month or two of potentially hard winter. And then does demand go up over in the Asian market, where we can potentially see it? All right, let's look at containers. So containers shipping confronts the very same situations with on-order capacity at 28% of existing tonnage. There's no way around it. The container shipping fleet is set to grow sharply over the next several years. Soft demand with frothy supply does not seem to be a recipe for a bottom anytime soon. That said, spot freight rates do appear to have reached a temporary bottom. We're seeing that with the freight rates coming down. If you come over here and look at the stocks, you have to remember what you're looking at in these stocks. Matson and Zim are the container carriers out there, and you see they're down. Matson down 30%, Zim down 68%, but the container leasing companies, Danos and Global Ship Lease, are less down, 21%, 26%. But again, I have a problem understanding that a little bit because they have bookings out a long time. I think it's a lot of people conflating them with container operators. I will mention something about Zim. A lot of people invested in Zim really heavily, then it bottomed out, and now it's down. I'm curious about what happens with Zim with the split of Maersk and MSC. Zim has been working with Maersk a lot. I would not be shocked to hear about an alliance between Maersk and Zim. I think that would be profitable for the company. I would imagine that they would get a big bump from that. That's the one we're going to wait and see. All right, let's go to story number 3. Story number 3 takes us over to Splash 24/7. Our buddy Sam Chambers. Shipyards faced with vexing capacity issues. So what's going on with shipyards? I just did a video, have it up in the show notes and the link up above, on 2023 shipbuilding. And this story came out right after I did this video. I wish I had it beforehand, but this is when it came out. And so Sam is talking about the fact that shipyards face some difficult decisions. The number of shipyards have contracted massively from the boom years of the first decade. Just to give you an idea, there are now only 131 large yards, down from 321 at the peak of the previous shipyard boom in 2009, a 40% decrease. So when people start telling you about, hey, let's go build ships overseas. Be careful about that because capacity is going down. Plus, we're seeing massive consolidation. Again, China, Japan, Korea control 94% of building in the world, but even their shipyard capacity is way down. Goes down here a little bit. The Shipyards forward order book cover that has edged up to 3.5 years from 2.5 years in 2020, and prices increased 5% across 2022, but were 15% higher on average in 2022 than 2021. Prices are going through the roof for ships. Less capacity out there to build, we're seeing prices increase. In the past few months, Splash has reported on the reopening of shuttered Chinese yard STX Dalian and Roggensheng, as well as the reopening of Hyundai Heavy Industries in South Korea, while construction of a brand new yard has started in northeast China that will be completed by the end of 2024. The new yard will be run by Dalian Shipping Industry, will focus on LNG. And if you go down here, he has the chart that I used in the video I did on shipbuilding from Fernley's. Give you a better view of that chart. Remove my big head here so you can see it. And one of the things that you see right here on this chart is the order book going out. Not as many orders so far out in 2026. Big orders in 2023. Where you're seeing those orders are in container ships and LNG, but look who's getting the orders. Korea is over their average. China is below their average. China is just about at their average, and Japan is well below their average, with almost no orders out into 2006. That really spells issues for Japanese shipbuilding, with Korea and China taking a larger share of the 94%. They're already at max. China's at 44%. Japan's down to 18%, with the rest of the 94% in the hands of Korea. So it's going to be interesting to watch this shipbuilding war that's taking place within a 1,000-mile circle around Okinawa in East Asia. A lot of people are talking about, hey, don't worry about building in the U.S. and Europe and these national countries. We'll just get everything built in China, Japan, and Korea. What happens if Japan goes away? What happens if it's concentrated just in Korea and China, and then something happens in East Asia? I don't know. But then all of a sudden, all your shipbuilding is concentrated there. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing a surge in the resurgence of national fleets. All right, let's go to story number 4. So story number 4 is one I have not mentioned, but it has been on the radar for everybody in shipping for just a long time. So this is Norwegian shipping magnate John Fredriksen. And John Fredriksen has been trying to consolidate two of the largest tanker firms together into one, and now he has bought his stake up to 22.6% in Euronav. So go over this story here. This is a Mike Schiller story. Fredriksen controlled Frontline terminated its merger agreement with Euronav back on January 9th, ending a deal to create the world's largest publicly traded oil tanker owner and operator, in which Frontline would become the majority owner. Euronav has rejected the termination, accusing Frontline of failing to provide a good reason for canceling their binding merger agreement. Euronav last week informed shareholders that it has filed for an application request for emergency arbitration in relation to the termination, while Frontline maintains that it's within its rights to terminate the agreement. Jump down here a little more. Last week, Euronav's largest shareholder, the Saviz family-controlled Compagnie Maritime Belgique, CMB, which controls more than 25% of the Euronav, and I apologize for my accent there, sought to quash the combination, requested to convene a general shareholders meeting during which CMB intends to seek to replace Euronav's existing supervisory board with members of its own choosing. So let's look at the financials. Here is Euronav, where they're trading right now. 15.64 on the market, and you'll see here this is over a 5-year period. They were peaking up there quite a bit during the contract renegotiation when they were talking about acquiring them, but they're up here. What's really interesting to note is the 5-year average. If you look at the max average here, which goes out back to 2015, really at their peak right now. So we definitely see them there. If at the same time you take a look over to Frontline at a much higher 13.4, you can see they're also at that peak. But if you go out to their max, you can see how flatline they've been since almost 2008. Back prior to 2008, really a lot higher. You've got a peak here of almost $350 a share back in the heydays. Now you're down to $13. And so one of the things that Fredriksen is trying to do is really put Euronav and Frontline together so that they create the behemoth. Back in the day when the Seven Sisters, the 7 big oil companies, ran not just oil refining and drilling and transportation and distribution, now these shipping companies are the intermediaries between them: Frontline, Euronav, OSG, a whole Nordic, a whole slew of these companies. But Euronav and Frontline are the number 4 and 2, or 2 and 4, I forget which one, companies out there. If you merge them together, they become number 1. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to create a tanker behemoth out there at a time when he thinks that we're going to see explosion. The problem is oil is under a lot of pressure because of decarbonization, emissions, green energy. Very different time than it was 10, 15 years ago. Story number 5 comes from our buddy John Conrad over at GCapt, and why seablindness, not Putin, could be the biggest energy threat. Let's read from his introduction here. Putin's attempt to destroy Ukraine has been met with powerful resistance, and his energy war against the West has been met with a determined response. His failures in both are centered on Putin underestimating the will of the Ukrainians and the ability of the West to quickly reroute LNG tankers, deploy grain ships to the Black Sea, and send U.S. merchant marine ships filled with military supplies to the Baltic and Mediterranean. He underestimated a seafaring nation and shipping itself. Exactly true. I mean, John, I think hits it right on here. LNG tankers were rerouted from Asia to Europe. We had a plethora of LNG tankers sitting off Europe. We've seen the introduction of storage facilities. We talked about this in the story before. You've seen it all. Grain ships in the Black Sea, talked about this. All of a sudden, we're seeing this. Now, granted, Russia wants to get its grain out, so they're willing to allow Ukraine to do this. Story we hadn't talked about is the sea lift of a lot of military equipment over to Europe for both routine rotation of troops for the United States, but also to build up defenses in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, and to bring over equipment that is being used by the Ukrainians. Expect to see potentially M1 tanks heading over fairly soon. But the issue that John gets in here is an issue of sea blindness. And the sea blindness he's talking about is the United States. So he breaks this down. He talks about the European energy, talks about China remaining a wild card here and what China can do. Talks about the worst case scenario here, which is either an international conflict or a major natural disaster, which could happen, which is all true. All that, the black swan events can happen. But the heart of his article goes back here to Washington remains apathetic to shipping. The consequences of the current global crisis could linger on for the Europeans, but the U.S. is already forgetting the lessons. Those at the helm, like Marad, Commandant Ann Phillips, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro, remain reticent to laud the contributions of the U.S. merchant marine transport vessels in the armed conflict and tepid in their enthusiasm for LNG and energy exportation. Moreover, they are shying away from taking a role of leadership in pinpointing maritime approaches to address the planet's energy needs, food shortages, or reinforce the role of the Navy in maritime security worldwide. He highlights the fact that Secretary Buttigieg has been out in front on issues with airlines, Southwest, notice to aviators, the NOTAMs that worked, issues on highways, bridges, you name it. But on issues of shipping and maritime, largely absent, especially when U.S. ships right now, whether ships from the Surge Reserve Fleet or commercial U.S. ships under the Maritime Security Program, are delivering goods necessary to aid the Ukrainians in stemming this Russian assault. And unfortunately, it tends to be fairly business as usual and not really paying attention. Goes on here and he talks about tomorrow's biggest threat. The biggest threat to global well-being is that we, the world, forget the heroic role of shipping has played in stabilizing global energy, food, and the supply chain. I mentioned this in the 10 questions that Bill Priestley asked me in the hot seat. I think one of the big things is we forget the role that the shipping and the mariners played. The biggest threat may now be the utter lack of maritime leadership in the United States, the continued unwillingness of European shipping executives to engage with Washington, D.C., and the decline of Western Navy's ability to secure the high seas without needing the help of nations like Turkey and China to broker deals. I mean, it was Turkey that brokered the grain deal largely to get the grain out of Ukraine. China has been really essential in many deals out there in Africa and across Asia. Goes on here, we must not forget the immense contribution of shipping to our global stability and security since the outbreak of COVID. We must recognize the importance of maritime leadership and the need for future collaboration between the U.S. and Europe to ensure full employment and safety of the Earth's greatest natural resources, our seas. I would expand on what John says here and say not just U.S. and Europe, but U.S. and all its allies, Japan, Korea, the Philippines. Remember, Filipino mariners make up the largest block of mariners out there, yet they're under attack right now because of issues about their training and qualifications. So there's a lot of efforts out there against shipping, and the most recent breakup of the 2M alliance, the reshuffling of those container ships, is going to be interesting to watch. The attempt to reshuffle tankers with the Frontline deal, really interesting to watch. The shift over in technology to hybrid propulsion and new energy techniques. Remember, electrical sounds great, but man, you're going to need a buttload of copper. And if you want that copper, it's got to come in ships from copper deposits around the world. So shipping plays a big role. The bulk market plays a big role. All of this is interconnected, and this is why this show tries to bring together 5 divergent stories and bring them together and talk about how shipping impacts you both in your normal lives, but also commercially, business, you name it. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's great to be back with What the Ship. Sorry for the 2-week hiatus. Didn't mean to be off that long, but we're back now. Weekly episodes coming your way. This show takes the most amount of time for me to put together, edit, and so it's a time-consuming one. And I love this show, want to keep doing it. And the way I do that is with your support. So number one, hey, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, hit that algorithm so that algorithm will get this out into the hands of other people. And if you want to support the channel directly, 2 ways you can do that. Number one, hit the super thanks button below. You can contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon, become a patron of the page. You'll find the link below in the show notes, or right over here. You'll see it pop up, and you'll be able to become a monthly or yearly patron of the page. Until our next episode, this is Sal, signing off.